The Manhattan skyline glowed amber through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Morrison and Associates as Valentina Ortiz reviewed her closing arguments one final time. At 29, she had already made junior partner at one of New York's most prestigious law firms, but the achievement felt hollow as she caught her reflection in the darkened computer screen. The late February cold pressed against the windows, frost patterns creeping along the edges like delicate lace, while the heating system hummed its constant white noise through the empty office. She had stayed late again, not because the case demanded it, but because going home meant facing the silence of her Upper West Side apartment and the remnants of another failed attempt at meal prep containers lined up in her refrigerator like small plastic coffins of good intentions. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother in Miami, a photo from her cousin Isabella's engagement party, everyone glowing and gorgeous in their cocktail dresses. Valentina's thumb hovered over the delete button before she set the phone face down, the weight of comparison pressing on her chest like a physical thing. The city lights below blurred as tears threatened, but she blinked them back with practiced efficiency, the same way she suppressed objections in court. 3 months ago, she had won a case that made headlines in the Times, but all her aunt had said at Thanksgiving was that she looked tired and asked if she was eating enough, then in the same breath mentioned how thin Isabella looked these days. The elevator ride down felt endless, each floor counting down like a timer on her patience with herself. In the lobby, she passed the security guard, Marcus, who had worked nights for 15 years and always asked about her cases with genuine interest. Tonight, though, she hurried past with just a wave, unable to bear the kindness in his eyes. Outside, the February wind cut through her wool coat, and she pulled it tighter, though she knew the cold she felt went deeper than weather. The subway platform stood nearly empty at this hour, just her and a few other late-night professionals, all avoiding eye contact, all carrying their own invisible burdens through the fluorescent-lit tunnels beneath the city. That night, standing in her apartment bathroom, she made a decision that would change everything. The scale read a number that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow had become the sum of her worth in her mind. She opened her laptop and began researching, not diet plans or gym memberships, but something more extreme, more decisive. The blue light from the screen illuminated her face in the darkness, casting shadows that made her look older, more desperate than she wanted to admit. She found what she was looking for in a clinic in Connecticut, discreet and expensive, promising rapid results for those willing to commit completely. The testimonials read like fairy tales, before and after photos that seemed impossible, yet there they were, smiling back at her from the screen. The next morning, she called in sick for the first time in 3 years, her voice steady as she lied to her secretary about a family emergency. The train to Connecticut ran along the Hudson River, ice chunks floating like broken pieces of winter, and she watched them drift past, feeling herself floating too, disconnected from the life she had built so carefully. The clinic was housed in what had once been a mansion, all white walls and minimalist furniture, the kind of place that whispered expensive in every carefully curated detail. Dr. Helena Morrison, no relation to her law firm despite the name, sat across from her with eyes that had seen too many desperate women to be surprised by anything anymore. The program was intensive, medically supervised, and promised to reshape not just her body, but her entire relationship with food and exercise. 50 pounds in 2 months was aggressive, but possible, Dr. Morrison explained, if Valentina was willing to commit completely. There would be daily monitoring, strict meal replacements, supervised exercise sessions, and psychological counseling. It wasn't just about losing weight. It was about breaking down everything she believed about herself and rebuilding from scratch. The cost was astronomical, more than most people made in a year, but Valentina had been saving for a future that never seemed to arrive. And what was money compared to the possibility of finally feeling comfortable in her own skin? She signed the papers without reading them thoroughly, something she would never do in her professional life, but this wasn't about logic or legal precedent. This was about survival, or at least that's what it felt like in that moment, sitting in that pristine white office with snow beginning to fall outside, each flake a tiny promise of transformation. The program would begin immediately, and she would need to take a leave of absence from work, something that would damage her career trajectory. But she was past caring about trajectories and timelines. All she wanted was to disappear, to shed the weight that had become armor she no longer wanted to wear. As she left the clinic that day, enrollment packet clutched in her hand, she didn't know that the real transformation wouldn't be what she expected, that losing 50 pounds would be the easiest part of what was coming. The hardest part would be discovering who she was, underneath all that protection she had built around herself, layer by layer, year after year, until she couldn't remember who she had been before the world taught her she wasn't enough. The snow continued to fall, covering the Connecticut landscape in white, erasing the lines between road and field, making everything look new and possible and terrifying in its blankness. 6 weeks into the program, Valentina stood in the mirror of her temporary apartment near the clinic, barely recognizing the woman staring back. 35 pounds had melted away like winter snow in an unexpected spring, but the face looking back seemed more haunted than triumphant. The early April rain drummed against the windows, a steady rhythm that matched the constant gnawing in her stomach. Though she had learned to interpret hunger as success, emptiness as achievement. Her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues asking when she would return, from friends wondering why she had disappeared, but she responded to none of them, existing in a bubble of meal replacements, exercise schedules, and weekly therapy sessions that scraped at wounds she didn't know existed. The clinic's gym had become her second home, 4 hours a day of carefully monitored exercise that left her muscles screaming and her mind blissfully empty. She had learned to love the burn, the way it silenced the voice in her head that questioned everything she was doing. The other women in the program moved through their routines like ghosts, each locked in their own private battle with bodies that had betrayed them by existing outside societal standards. There was Sarah from Boston, a pediatric surgeon who hadn't worn a swimsuit in 10 years, and Michelle from DC, whose husband had left her for his 23-year-old assistant. They didn't talk much, but their shared exhaustion created a strange kinship, warriors in a war nobody else could see. It was during a mandatory group therapy session that she first heard his name. Dr. Morrison had brought in a guest speaker, a photographer named Ignacio Reeves, who was documenting American body image culture for a book project. He was 35, with the kind of quiet intensity that made you lean in when he spoke, his words careful and considered like he was developing them in a dark room. He talked about his work, photographing people in their most vulnerable moments, not to exploit, but to honor the complexity of human experience. His dark eyes swept the room, taking in the carefully controlled environment, the women in their identical workout clothes, the walls covered with motivational quotes that felt more like commands than encouragement. When he asked if anyone would be willing to be photographed for his project, the room fell silent. The thought of being captured in this state, mid-transformation, neither before nor after, seemed like the worst kind of exposure. But something in Valentina stirred. A recklessness born from weeks of deprivation and discipline. She raised her hand before she could stop herself, her voice cracking as she said yes, she would do it. The other women looked at her with a mixture of admiration and horror, but Ignacio simply nodded, his expression unreadable as he wrote down her contact information. The photo session was scheduled for the following week, in an old warehouse in Bridgeport that Ignacio had converted into a studio. The space was nothing like the clinical perfection of the weight loss center. It was raw and honest, with exposed brick walls and large windows that let in unfiltered light. He didn't pose her or tell her how to stand. Instead, he talked to her while he worked, asking about her life before the program, about what she hoped to find on the other side of this transformation. His questions were gentle but probing, like he was developing her story alongside her image, bringing hidden truths to light. As she talked, she found herself telling him things she hadn't even admitted in therapy, about the partner meeting where a senior colleague had suggested she might be taken more seriously if she presented herself better, about the man she had dated who told her she would be perfect if she just lost a few pounds, about the mother who loved her fiercely but couldn't hide the disappointment in her eyes when Valentina came home for holidays. The camera clicked steadily as she spoke, capturing not just her shrinking body, but the raw emotion that spilled out with each confession. Ignacio said little, but his presence was steady, an anchor in the storm of her unraveling. When he showed her the contact sheets the following week, she almost didn't recognize herself again, but for different reasons this time. The woman in the photographs wasn't the polished lawyer or the desperate dieter. She was something more raw and real, caught between becoming and unbecoming. Her body, still in transition, looked powerful rather than incomplete. Her face, without the mask of professional composure, revealed a vulnerability that was somehow more beautiful than any made-up perfection. Ignacio watched her study the images, his hands steady on the table between them, and asked her a simple question that shattered something inside her. Who are you doing this for? The question followed her back to the clinic, through her workouts and weigh-ins, through the careful portion-controlled meals and the group sessions where everyone celebrated her progress. She was ahead of schedule, on track to lose the full 50 pounds before the 2-month mark, but the victory felt increasingly hollow. The other women looked at her with envy, asking for her secret. But the secret was that she felt more lost than when she started. The number on the scale decreased daily, but the weight of Ignacio's question grew heavier, pressing on her chest during her runs, filling her throat during meals, keeping her awake in the narrow bed of her temporary apartment, while rain continued to fall over Connecticut like a benediction she couldn't quite receive. The morning Valentina hit her goal weight, the clinic erupted in celebration. 50 pounds in 56 days, a transformation that would be featured in their promotional materials. A success story to inspire future clients. Dr. Morrison presented her with a certificate of completion, like she was graduating from something, though what exactly, Valentina couldn't say. The scale displayed numbers that should have meant everything, but as she stood in the lobby waiting for her exit interview, watching the early May sunshine stream through windows she had first entered in the grey depths of winter, she felt more untethered than triumphant. Her body, now fitting into sizes she hadn't worn since college, felt foreign, like she was walking around in a costume that everyone else admired, but that she couldn't quite recognize as herself. Back in Manhattan, the return to Morrison and Associates was orchestrated like a comeback tour. Her secretary had decorated her office with welcome-back balloons, and colleagues who had barely noticed her before stopped by to compliment her transformation. The senior partner, who had once suggested she present herself better, now invited her to lunch at the Yale Club, talking about her potential for making senior partner before 35. But sitting across from him in that wood-paneled room, eating a salad she didn't want, while he consumed his steak with unconscious pleasure, she felt the absurdity of it all pressing down, like the weight she had lost had simply relocated to her chest. She had kept Ignacio's business card in her wallet, pulling it out sometimes during meetings, running her thumb over the raised lettering like a talisman. 3 weeks after returning to work, after another hollow victory in court that everyone attributed to her new confidence rather than her legal skills, she called him. His voice on the phone was exactly as she remembered, steady and warm, and when he suggested meeting at a coffee shop in Brooklyn rather than Manhattan, she felt relief at the possibility of existing somewhere outside her carefully constructed world. The shop was in Williamsburg, all exposed pipes and mismatched furniture, filled with people who looked like they had more interesting problems than weight loss. Ignacio was already there when she arrived, sitting by a window with 2 cups of coffee with real cream, not the carefully measured alternatives she had grown accustomed to. He studied her as she sat down, his photographer's eye taking in the changes, but his first words weren't about her appearance. Instead, he asked about the case she had mentioned during their photo session, the pro bono work she had wanted to do before getting caught up in the partnership track. They talked for 3 hours, the coffee growing cold as the afternoon sun moved across the scarred wooden table. He told her about his own journey, how he had left a lucrative career in advertising photography to document real stories, accepting financial uncertainty in exchange for authenticity. He showed her new photographs from his project, women of all sizes and ages captured in moments of genuine emotion rather than posed perfection. There was a 90-year-old dancer still teaching ballet in Harlem, her body a map of decades, but her grace undimmed. There was a construction worker in Queens, muscles built from labor rather than gym equipment, radiant with the confidence of capability rather than appearance. When he asked if she would sit for him again to complete the series he had started during her time at the clinic, she hesitated. The thought of being photographed at her goal weight should have been appealing, the after to complete her before and during, but something held her back. She had worked so hard to reach this point, but sitting there with Ignacio, she realized she had no idea what came next. The goal had been the weight loss, but now that she had achieved it, the emptiness she had expected to fill remained, shaped differently but still present. He seemed to understand her hesitation without explanation, suggesting instead that she come to his studio just to see the complete series he was working on. The warehouse in Bridgeport had been transformed since her last visit, the walls now covered with large prints of his work, a gallery of human stories told through bodies that defied conventional beauty standards. She stood before them, seeing herself reflected not in the physical forms, but in the emotions captured in each frame: defiance, exhaustion, joy, sorrow, and above all, a kind of radical acceptance that she couldn't quite grasp, but desperately wanted to understand. That evening, as they walked along the East River, the Manhattan skyline glowing gold in the sunset, Ignacio told her something that shifted everything. He had been following her career, reading about her cases, seeing how she fought for justice in the courtroom with the same intensity she had applied to transforming her body. But he wondered, he said carefully, what would happen if she applied that energy to fighting for herself, not against herself. The question hung between them like the last light of day, and when he kissed her goodbye at the subway station, gentle and uncertain, she felt something crack open inside her, not breaking but possibly, finally, beginning to heal. By late June, Valentina's life had developed a rhythm that outsiders might have envied, but that felt increasingly unsustainable to her. She maintained her new weight with the vigilance of a security guard, every meal weighed and measured, every workout scheduled and completed, every compliment about her transformation accepted with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. The senior partnership was all but guaranteed, her caseload had doubled, and she had been featured in the firm's annual report as an example of excellence and dedication. But in the quiet moments between court appearances and client meetings, she found herself thinking about Ignacio's photographs, about the women who wore their bodies like homes rather than prisons. Their relationship had evolved slowly, carefully, like developing film in a dark room, revealed gradually in the red light of vulnerability. He never commented on what she ate or didn't eat, never praised her for maintaining her weight loss, never treated her body as an achievement to be celebrated. Instead, he saw her, the actual her, the one who cried during closing arguments about custody battles, who sent money anonymously to a food bank in the Bronx, who still called her mother every Sunday, even though the conversations always left her feeling inadequate. He photographed her not as a success story, but as a work in progress, and in his lens, she began to see herself differently. The crisis came in July, during the firm's annual retreat in the Hamptons. Standing at the pool in a bikini she had bought to celebrate reaching her goal weight, surrounded by colleagues who showered her with compliments about her discipline and transformation, she felt something inside her snap. Not break, but release, like a rubber band that had been stretched too far for too long. She excused herself, walking to the beach beyond the manicured lawns, and sat in the sand in her designer swimsuit, watching the waves crash against the shore with relentless persistence. Her phone rang, and without looking she knew it was Ignacio. He had an uncanny ability to sense when she needed him, though they had never explicitly discussed it. His voice was calm as always as he told her about a project he had been invited to join, documenting recovery and resilience in communities across America. It would mean traveling for several months, capturing stories of people rebuilding their lives after various forms of trauma. He wanted her to come with him, not as a subject but as a partner, using her legal skills to help the people they met navigate systems that often seemed designed to defeat them. The proposition was absurd. She was months away from making senior partner, from achieving everything she had worked for since law school. Leaving now would be career suicide, would waste the very transformation that had opened these doors. But sitting there on that beach, feeling the weight of maintaining a body that required constant vigilance, of succeeding in a system that had only valued her once she had literally diminished herself, she realized that the real transformation she needed had nothing to do with pounds lost or gained. She gave her notice the following Monday, sitting in the senior partner's office as he cycled through confusion, anger, and finally a dismissive certainty that she would regret this decision once she came to her senses. Her mother cried on the phone, asking how she could throw away everything she had worked for, including the weight loss that had made her finally beautiful. But Valentina felt lighter than she had in months. Not from restriction, but from release, from choosing a path that wasn't about becoming smaller, but about becoming more herself. The night before they left New York, she stood in her empty apartment, the furniture sold or donated, her life reduced to what would fit in a car. Ignacio found her there, sitting on the floor, surrounded by the designer clothes that no longer fit quite right. Not because her body had changed, but because her sense of self had shifted. He sat beside her, not speaking, his presence solid and sure. She told him then about the deepest fear, that without the structure of restriction and achievement, she wouldn't know who she was. That she had spent so long trying to be less that she didn't know how to be more. He pulled out his camera then, the same one he had used in their first session, and began photographing her there in that empty apartment, surrounded by the detritus of a life she was leaving behind. But these weren't portraits of transformation or triumph. They were documents of transition, of a woman caught between who she had been told to be and who she might become. In the last frame, barely visible in the dying light from the windows, she was laughing, really laughing, for the first time in longer than she could remember. The story that began with losing 50 pounds in 2 months ended with something far more complex than weight loss. As they drove out of New York the next morning, the city's skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror, Valentina didn't know what she would find on this journey. She didn't know if she would maintain her weight loss or if it would even matter. She didn't know if her relationship with Ignacio would survive the reality of daily life outside the intensity of transformation. What she did know was that for the first time in her adult life, she was choosing based on who she wanted to be, rather than who others expected her to be. The GPS announced their first destination, a small town in Pennsylvania where they would document a community rebuilding after economic collapse. And she felt her own rebuilding begin, not from the outside in this time, but from somewhere deeper, truer, and infinitely more sustainable than any number on a scale could ever be.